Hello! Today, we'll be looking at the strongest objection to the standard view of God's omniscience that I have ever seen, as articulated by Josh Rasmussen. To start off with, we'll give the standard definition of omniscience. A person is omniscient when they know all true propositions and believe no false propositions. This begs the question, what is a proposition? Well, here's a kind of intuitive explanation. Consider the sentence, snow is white, and the sentence, la neige est blanche. One is English and the other is French, but they mean the same thing. This shared meaning behind the sentences is the proposition that they refer to. It is the thing which can either be true or false, and is usually denoted by a lowercase letter. So the idea is that we take all the propositions that there are, and then for each and every true proposition, God has knowledge of that proposition in his mind, which I've denoted with a big K and a subscript. Knowledge, as philosophers define it, is a belief which meets certain criteria, such as being true and being justified. So God's items of knowledge here are beliefs, and God has no beliefs beyond his knowledge of all true propositions. Now I want to give you an idea of how complex God's knowledge actually is. Take some true proposition like turtles exist, which I'll denote with P sub 0. Because it's true, God knows it. Let's say P sub 1 is the proposition that God knows P sub 0. It's also true, so God knows it. Let's say P sub 2 is a proposition that God knows P sub 1. It's true, so God knows it. You really quickly get this infinite hierarchy of knowledge within God. But then you can make propositions about that entire hierarchy, like P sub infinity. The proposition that God knows P sub 0 and P sub 1 and P sub 2 and so on. And then you could define P sub infinity plus 1, the proposition that God knows P sub infinity. And then you could get another hierarchy on top of the previous hierarchy. And then you could build another hierarchy on top of that hierarchy. And there's an infinity of infinite hierarchies like this that come along with each and every proposition that God knows. So, Josh Rasmussen, a Christian philosopher, pondered this and asked God how he knew so many infinities. Josh eventually came to the conclusion that it is actually logically impossible for God to know everything. Wow, how did he come to this conclusion? Well, here's a way of illustrating his reasoning. We'll start by looking at some propositions about the properties of things that exist. So, here are all the things in existence. I didn't manage to fit them all on screen, but I'm pretty sure I got most of them. Now we can take the property of being human, for example, and from it construct the proposition that all the things with the property of being human are, and then just make a big list of all the humans. To visualize this, I'm going to put all the humans in the circle here. I'm doing this because our goal is to pick out a proposition that divides reality into two parts. In this case, we divide reality into the humans and the non-humans. Coolio. And because this proposition is true, then God's knowledge of it, which I'll denote K subhuman, will also exist. We could do this for any property we want. Like, we can also pick out the proposition that all the things with the property of being a turtle are, and then make a list of all turtles. This divides reality into turtles and non-turtles, and guarantees the existence of K sub-turtles. Or, all the things with the property of being horned are, and divide reality into the horned and non-horned things, guaranteeing the existence of K sub-horned. Now here's an interesting one. The property of being knowledge. All the things with the property of being knowledge are, and then we make a list of all the items of knowledge in existence, including the items of knowledge we just said God had. This proposition is going to guarantee the existence of God's knowledge of this proposition, K sub-knowledge. But wait, K sub-knowledge has the property of being knowledge, so it goes in its own circle. It appears in the big list of all things that are knowledge. It's self-referential. Thinking back to our previous examples, K sub-turtle is not itself a turtle, so it's outside of its own circle. To remember that, I'm going to write the word out right here. And K subhuman isn't a human, so it goes outside its own circle. And the same goes for K sub-horned. K sub-knowledge goes inside its own circle. So I'm going to write the word in right here. Some of God's knowledge is out knowledge, and some of it is in knowledge. Another example of in knowledge might be God's knowledge of all things that are complicated. This itself will be complicated. Another example of outknowledge is God's knowledge of all cats, because that's not a cat. Now, Josh Rasmussen wants us to consider the proposition that all the things with the property of being outknowledge are, and then a list of all outknowledge, including K sub cat and K sub turtle and so on. Now, this proposition is true, so this guarantees the existence of K sub outknowledge. Now, does K sub outknowledge itself possess the property of being outknowledge? Well, there are only two possibilities. It's either inside the circle or it's not. If it is outside the circle, then it's outknowledge. That's just what we defined outknowledge to mean. But the circle divides reality into things which are outknowledge and things which aren't, with all the outknowledge going on the inside of the circle. So if we put K sub outknowledge outside the circle, it actually goes on the inside. But if we put it on the inside, then it becomes in-knowledge. And once again, the circle divides reality so that anything which wasn't outknowledge goes on the outside. So it should actually go on the outside. So we've deduced that if it is outknowledge, then it isn't outknowledge, and if it isn't outknowledge, then it is outknowledge. What this means is that it's impossible for this item of knowledge to exist. Its properties are logically contradictory. So this proposition that we started with, all the things with the property of being outknowledge are, and then a list of all outknowledge, this proposition cannot be known by God. And since there is a proposition which God cannot know, then God is not omniscient. Now, Josh Rasmussen has a solution to this problem, which he calls a dynamic model of omniscience. On his view, God isn't aware of everything. He only has knowledge of some things, but at any point, he can expand his knowledge as much as he desires. This resolves the paradox because Josh explicitly accepts that God might only be aware of some of his outknowledge at any given time. But this raises a question. Does God know all propositions on Josh's view? Josh says, yes. On his view, the proposition that XYZ is true actually is identical to God's awareness of XYZ. He's taking a stance about the nature of what it means to be a proposition called divine conceptualism. And since what's in God's awareness is dynamic and can change based on his free will, then that means what propositions there are will be changing as well. So 100% of true propositions are always known by God at any given time. But what propositions there are can vary. Given our definition of omniscience earlier, God counts as omniscient on Josh's view. That's one way around this omniscience paradox, but I'm going to suggest 3 other ways of escape, if you will. The first is that I think we can get Josh's view to work without any of this divine conceptualism stuff. Propositions could totally be something else, and I think his theory could still work. Here's my reasoning. This is Jim. He knows that Paris is in France. However, he's not aware of that fact right now, because he's entirely focused on what he wants to have for dinner. But if this fact isn't in his awareness, then in what sense does he know that Paris is in France? Well, he knows that Paris is in France in virtue of his ability to effortlessly bring this fact into his awareness. If that's all that's needed for knowledge in Jim's case, then it seems we could apply that reasoning to God as well. He could effortlessly bring any proposition into his awareness, so he knows all propositions. We could avoid the paradox the same way Josh does, while taking on fewer, or at least different, commitments. My second suggestion is that we just deny that these problematic propositions even exist. To give you a feel for what I mean by that, let's look at the liar paradox. This sentence is false. Supposedly, there's a proposition behind the sentence. But if that proposition is true, then it isn't true. And if that proposition is false, then it isn't false. But that's the only 2 options for propositions. This means that this sentence can't refer to any proposition at all. So some sentences might look like they refer to propositions, but in reality they do not. With that out of the way, I want to draw a parallel between Josh's omniscience paradox and the famous omnipotence paradox of the stone. For the omnipotence paradox, we define a task. Make a rock so big that God cannot lift it. The paradox gets its power by defining the task in terms of God's ability to perform tasks. then, aha, we find a contradiction in omnipotence. For if God can perform all tasks, then he can perform this task, and if he can perform this task, he could bring it about that he cannot perform the task of lifting that rock. God is an incoherent entity. Now, a theist who hears this is going to say, hold up, you just used some words to define a task, but not all strings of words actually succeed in defining tasks. Some strings of words are just nonsense. Now, one of the words you used is God, which by its definition means a being who can perform all tasks. So, a rock so big that God cannot lift it is logically equivalent to a rock so big that a being that can perform all tasks cannot perform the task of lifting it. That's an incoherent contradiction. It doesn't mean anything, it's just gobbledygook. So I reject that your string of words actually refers to a task. Now, let's compare this to the omniscience paradox. We start by defining a proposition. Insert list here is a list of all God's knowledge which isn't about itself. This proposition is defined in terms of God's knowledge of propositions. And then we come to the conclusion that there's a contradiction within omniscience. God's knowledge of this proposition is about itself if and only if it is not about itself. A theist who hears this should say, hold up, you just used some words to define a proposition, but not all strings of words actually succeed in picking out propositions. Some strings of words are just nonsense. Now, one of the words you used is God, which by its definition means a being who knows all true propositions. So, insert list here is a list of all God's knowledge which isn't about itself is logically equivalent to insert list here is a list of all the knowledge which isn't about itself of a being which knows all true propositions. That's as internally contradictory as before, because that proposition, if it did exist, both is and is not about itself. It doesn't mean anything. This is also just gobbledygook. So I reject that your string of words actually refers to a proposition. Now, this unravels the paradox, because if we weren't actually picking out a proposition earlier, then that means that we cannot infer that there is a proposition which God cannot know. And that means that we cannot conclude that God is not omniscient. However, there is still a problem. This proposition basically just acknowledged the existence of things with the property of being outknowledge. That's all it did. And outknowledge does exist in the real world. You yourself have some. What this means is that by denying that there is such a proposition, I'm saying that there is a feature of reality that lacks a proposition corresponding to this feature. And that seems weird. However, we all actually need to say that this does happen every so often. Take the proposition, all propositions which are not about themselves are not about themselves. This sentence seems to refer to a proposition which is so obviously true that it isn't even worth talking about. However, this sentence does not have a proposition behind it. For we can put all propositions this sentence is about into a circle, and put all the propositions the sentence is not about outside the circle. Let's call the proposition the sentence supposedly refers to W. If W is outside the circle, then it is not about itself and should go into the circle. If it is inside the circle, then it is about itself and should go outside the circle. So this proposition can't be about itself, nor can it be not about itself. Thus this sentence cannot refer to any proposition. But it is a feature of reality that propositions which are not about themselves are not about themselves. So some features of reality do not have corresponding propositions. Josh Rasmussen, rather than finding a problem with omniscience, just found one more feature of reality that doesn't have a corresponding proposition. Now, I think the strongest challenge to this line of argumentation is that, while an omniscience where God knows all true propositions may be logically defensible, it doesn't actually seem to get at the spirit of omniscience, because omniscience is really about God knowing all features of reality. I think this is a strong response, but I'd counter by saying, actually, the spirit of omniscience is having God's thoughts overlap completely and perfectly with truth. And hey, the things that have the capacity to be true are propositions. So that's what omniscience is about. If that leaves a bad taste in your mouth, I do have an alternative way of utilizing this reasoning. See, some theists think that it's wrong to view God's knowledge as broken up into individual beliefs. Rather, God's knowledge of everything is just one unified understanding of all of reality. Instead of a belief about turtles and a belief about humans and so on, God's mind just grasps all of reality, which includes turtles and humans. This view of God's knowledge seems to avoid the paradox, but not so fast. Josh thinks you can recreate the paradox with facts about God's knowledge. For example, here's a fact about God's knowledge of everything. God's knowledge of everything includes knowledge of all facts. This fact about God's knowledge is referencing all facts, so it is indirectly referencing itself. Then it seems we can make a proposition about all propositions which do not make this sort of self-reference. But this proposition about non-self-reference can't self-reference, nor can it not self-reference, due to similar reasoning we've seen in this video already. I know I'm going over this part pretty quickly. Basically, this proposition is contradictory in nature. Josh uses this as a reason to reject this view of God's knowledge, but I would instead say that this is a reason to just deny that this feature of reality has a corresponding proposition. So we get full-blown omniscience and no contradictions. Yay! I will say in passing though that Josh is skeptical of this view. He prefers to just get rid of self-reference altogether, which his theory allows him to do. The third suggestion I have is to maintain that God's knowledge is partially implicit. Here's my thought process. You know that 2 plus 2 equals 4, and you probably also know that Paris is in France. But did you know this longer proposition? 2 plus 2 equals 4, and Paris is in France. Now chances are you've never thought this exact proposition. It's never entered your awareness. You've never even considered it. So before I brought it up just now, did you know it? It seems plausible that, yes, you did know it. It was implicitly known because it's just a conjunction of knowledge you already had. Now maybe God's knowledge of his out-knowledge is implicitly known. The idea is that we pick out every proposition of the form, knowledge of proposition blank constitutes out-knowledge. If God knows all of those, then he implicitly knows their conjunction. But this big conjunction simply is God's knowledge of all out-knowledge. So the paradox evaporates because he can know everything, even though some of that knowledge might be implicit. So there you have it. Those are my thoughts on Josh Rasmussen's omniscience paradox. You'll notice that the central point of Josh's argument, that God cannot have a single belief that constitutes knowledge of all his out-knowledge, is logically inescapable. So any response, like the 3 I sketched here, is going to have to give an account of God's knowledge such that this is not actually a problem. Anyways, that's the end of this video. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe if you enjoyed this content.